controlling concurrent access to entity data with locking. This chapter details how to handle concurrent access to entity data and the locking strategies available to Java Persistence API application developers. The following topics are addressed here. Overview of entity locking and concurrency lock modes. Overview of entity locking and concurrency. Entity data is concurrently accessed if the data in the data source is accessed at the same time by multiple applications. Special care must be taken to ensure that the underlying data's integrity is preserved when accessed concurrently. When data is updated in the database tables in a transaction, the persistence provider assumes that the database management system will hold short-term read locks and long-term write locks to maintain data integrity. Most persistence providers will delay database writes until the end of the transaction, except when the application explicitly calls for a flush, that is, the application calls the entity manager flush method or executes queries with the flush mode set to auto. By default, persistence providers use optimistic locking, where, before committing changes to the data, the persistence provider checks that no other transaction has modified or deleted the data since the data was read. This is accomplished by a version column in the database table, with a corresponding version attribute in the entity class. When a row is modified, the version value is incremented. The original transaction checks the version attribute, and if the data has been modified by another transaction, a JAVX persistence optimistic lock exception will be thrown, and the original transaction will be rolled back. When the application specifies optimistic lock modes, the persistence provider verifies that a particular entity has not changed since it was read from the database, even if the entity data was not modified. Pessimistic locking goes further than optimistic locking. With pessimistic locking, the persistence provider creates a transaction that obtains a long-term lock on the data until the transaction is completed, which prevents other transactions from modifying or deleting the data until the lock has ended. Pessimistic locking is a better strategy than optimistic locking when the underlying data is frequently accessed and modified by many transactions. Caution: using pessimistic locks on entities that are not subject to frequent modification may result in decreased application performance. Using optimistic locking. The JAVX persistence version annotation is used to mark a persistent field or property as a version attribute of an entity. By adding a version attribute, the entity is enabled for optimistic concurrency control. The version attribute is read and updated by the persistence provider when an entity instance is modified during a transaction. The application may read the version attribute, but must not modify the value. Note: although some persistence providers may support optimistic locking for entities that do not have a version attribute, portable applications should always use entities with a version attribute when using optimistic locking. If the application attempts to lock an entity without a version attribute, and the persistence provider doesn't support optimistic locking for non-version entities, a persistence exception will be thrown. The version annotation has the following requirements. Only a single version attribute may be defined per entity. The version attribute must be in the primary table for an entity mapped to multiple tables. The type of the version attribute must be one of the following: int, integer, long, short, and Java. SQL. Timestamp. The following code snippet shows how to define a version attribute in an entity with persistent fields. Version protected int version. The following code snippet shows how to define a version attribute in an entity with persistent properties. Version protected short get version. Lock modes. The application may increase the level of locking for an entity by specifying the use of lock modes. Lock modes may be specified to increase the level of optimistic locking or to request the use of pessimistic locks. The use of optimistic lock modes causes the persistence provider to check the version attributes for entities that were read but not modified during a transaction, as well as for those entities that were updated. The use of pessimistic lock mode specifies that the persistence provider is to immediately acquire long-term read or write locks for the database data corresponding to entity state. The lock mode for an entity operation may be set by specifying one of the lock modes defined in the JAVX persistence Lock mode type enumerated type, listed in Table 37-1. Table 37-1 lock modes for concurrent entity access. Lock mode description: optimistic obtain and optimistic read lock for all entities with a version attribute. Optimistic force increment obtain and optimistic read lock for all entities with a version attribute, and increment the version attribute value. Pessimistic read immediately obtain a long-term read lock on the data to prevent the data from being modified or deleted. Other transactions may read the data while the lock is maintained, but may not modify or delete the data. The persistence provider is permitted to obtain a database write lock when a read lock was requested, but not vice versa. Pessimistic write immediately obtain a long-term write lock on the data to prevent the data from being read, modified, or deleted. Pessimistic force increment immediately obtain a long-term lock on the data to prevent the data from being modified or deleted, and increment the version attribute of version entities. Read a synonym for optimistic. Use of lock mode type. Optimistic is to be preferred for new applications. Write a synonym for optimistic force increment. Use of lock mode type. Optimistic force increment is to be preferred for new applications. No additional locking will occur on the data in the database. Setting the lock mode. The lock mode may be specified by one of the following techniques. Calling the entity manager. Lock and passing in one of the lock modes. Entity manager M equal. Person equal. M. Lock person, lock mode type. Optimistic. Calling one of the entity manager. Find methods that takes the lock mode as a parameter. Entity manager M equal. String person pk equal. Person equal M. Find person. Class person pk, lock mode type. Pessimistic write. Calling one of the entity manager. Refresh methods that takes the lock mode as a parameter. Entity manager M equal. String person pk equal. Person equal M. Find person. Class person pk. M. Refresh person, lock mode type. Optimistic force increment. Calling the query. Set lock mode or type query. Set lock mode method, passing the lock mode as the parameter. Query Q equal M. Create query. Q. Set lock mode type. Pessimistic force increment. Adding a lock mode element to the named query annotation. Named query name equal lock person query. Query equals select P from person P where P. Name like. Name, lock mode equal pessimistic read. Using pessimistic locking. Version entities as well as entities that do not have a version attribute can be locked pessimistically. To lock entities pessimistically, set the lock mode to pessimistic read, pessimistic write, or pessimistic force increment. If a pessimistic lock cannot be obtained on the database rows, and the failure to lock the data results in a transaction rollback, a pessimistic lock exception is thrown. If a pessimistic lock cannot be obtained, but the locking failure doesn't result in a transaction rollback, a lock timeout exception is thrown. Pessimistically locking a version entity with pessimistic force increment results in the version attribute being incremented, even if the entity data is unmodified. When pessimistically locking a version entity, the persistence provider will perform the version checks that occurred during optimistic locking, and if the version check fails, an optimistic lock exception will be thrown. Attempting to lock a non-version entity with pessimistic force increment is not portable and may result in a persistence exception if the persistence provider doesn't support optimistic locks for non-version entities. Locking a version entity with pessimistic write results in the version attribute being incremented if the transaction was successfully committed. Pessimistic locking timeouts. The length of time in milliseconds the persistence provider should wait to obtain a lock on the database tables may be specified using the JAVX. Persistence. Lock. Timeout property. If the time it takes to obtain a lock exceeds the value of this property, a lock timeout exception will be thrown, but the current transaction will not be marked for rollback. If this property is set to 0, the persistence provider should throw a lock timeout exception if it cannot immediately obtain a lock. Note: portable applications should not rely on the setting of JAVX. Persistence. Lock. Timeout, as the locking strategy and underlying database may mean that the timeout value cannot be used. The value of JAVX. Persistence. Lock. Timeout is a hint, not a contract. This property may be set programmatically by passing it to the entity manager methods that allow lock modes to be specified, the query, set lock mode and type query. Set lock mode methods, the named query annotation, and as a property to the persistence. Create entity manager factory method. It may also be set as a property in the persistence XML deployment descriptor. If JAVX, persistence, lock, timeout is set in multiple places, the value will be determined in the following order. The argument to one of the entity manager or query methods, the setting in the named query annotation, the argument to the persistence create entity manager factory method, the value in the persistence XML deployment descriptor.